Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Section 8 of his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, David Hume has some rather interesting, to say the least, reflections on the nature of crime, justice, human actions, punishment, what laws are supposed to be about. And he begins this section by telling us that the basic assumption of laws, they're all founded on rewards and punishment. And, this is the way that laws work. They tell us, do this, and if you don't do this, then you will be punished, and do this, and you'll be rewarded. But, that's kind of a stretch to say that that's the real foundation of laws. There's also like the moral norm involved and all that. But he tells us that it's being supposed as a fundamental principle that these motives have a regular and uniform influence on the mind and both produce the good and prevent the bad actions. And he says we can give to this influence what name we please, but it's usually conjoined with the action. So what he means here are what we typically call motives, motivations, intentions. Now, there's a lot of looseness in moral psychology and in ethics in picking out exactly what, a motive is as opposed to an intention. If you read somebody coming a little bit later than Hume, like Jeremy Bentham, for example, you notice that he has a quite rigid distinction between the two of them. But we can sort of lump them all in together here and say that Hume is interested in the fact that the law looks to the motive of the person or assumes the motive of the person in its administration of rewards and punishments. So let's look at these two assumptions built into this a little bit more closely. Hume has been arguing in Section 8 that motives do have a uniform influence on the human mind. So if we do understand the motive that a person has, that is, the way in which their thinking works or their what we call motivational structure, which is how they want to get the goods and avoid evils, right? If we understand all of those sorts of things, we should be able to predict the way a person will behave or to explain why they did the action that they did. And so this is very important for legal matters and punitive or reward matters, isn't it? We want to say, okay, this person here is incorrigible. They're always going to behave this way. Incorrigible means unable to be corrected, right? And you would be correcting somebody with reward and punishment. This person here is screwed up, but they are corrigible. We can modify the way in which their motives work and then produce the actions if we tinker around with their motivational structure. So if we notice that, people who, let's take a great example, people who commit revenge killings, right, are motivated by this entire dynamic over here, and we see that somebody is, for whatever reason, we think that that's going on in their head, we can assume that they're going to engage in a revenge killing. Or if we know that people steal when they are at a last resort and hungry, and we see that people over here are at a last resort and hungry, we can say, well, they're going to steal, right? So motives have a uniform influence. Motives produce the good or bad actions, or also, to prevent evil, he says, as well. So, this is, I think, pretty uncontroversial as well. So Hume thinks that, he says, laws are basically about this. We can give to this influence what name we please, but as it is usually conjoined with the action, he says, it must be esteemed a cause and looked upon as an instance of that necessity that we would here establish. And we can understand this necessity, just to remind ourselves, in two connected ways. We have this sort of habit or custom built up on the basis of observing things out there in the world. And when it comes to human motivations, we can also look at ourselves and say, well, I behave this way. I bet other people will behave this way as well. And so there's the things that happen that there's some sort of constant conjunction. Presumably, this motive is constantly conjoined with this action over here. Hume thinks we can actually look back into history or across cultures and see constants of this sort. And then there is the sort of inferences going on in our own minds, both of which he says are instances of necessity. We're grasping what we at least understand of causality. So this is very important. Why? Hume says the only proper object of hatred or vengeance is a person or creature endowed with thought and consciousness. When any criminal or injurious actions excite that passion, hatred or vengeance, it is only by their relation to the person or connection with him. So, when we ask ourselves, okay, what is it that we actually do feel hatred or vengeance towards? Hume is going to say it's not actually the action per se, it's the action as indicative of something else. Now, he goes on and he tells us that actions, by their own nature, are temporary and perishing. So if I talk to you in a mean way today, you'd be like, Dr. Sadler, that guy's a jerk, Maybe I'm not a jerk, though. Maybe I'm just a jerk today, in this instance, with you, but I'm, talking nicely with somebody an hour later, right? Actions can change very much from situation to situation, and they're perishing. They disappear. Once you're done with the action, there are effects of the action, but the action is gone, right? The action can be, as he says, against, morality or religion, or pick whatever you want, and therefore can be blamable. So you can say, don't do that kind of action. When we're talking to little kids, we're like, hey, quit hitting your brother, right? Don't push that person down the stairs. Quit pulling the dog's tail, right? We say, don't do that action because it's against some sort of rule or some sort of standard, right? But the actions by themselves aren't really what we want to punish. Now, that's kind of interesting because if you think about the way laws are typically framed, quite often, laws or rules or procedures, whatever we want to say, look at the action and they say, you do this, I don't care why you did it, you're getting the stick, you're getting punished, right? You're getting a fine. Now, when we administer laws as rational agents, we often start to think, okay, well, why did this person do this? Maybe we don't come down hard on them about that. Maybe we come up with some alternative punishment that will be rehabilitative rather than merely retributive or punitive, right? So he says that actions where they don't proceed from some cause in the character and disposition of the person who performed them, they can neither redound to his honor if good, nor infamy if evil. The actions may be blamable, but the person is not answerable for them if they're just sort of temporary. And as they proceed from nothing in him that's durable and constant, leave nothing of that nature behind him, it is impossible he can, upon their account, become the object of punishment or vengeance. Now, it's interesting. Hume doesn't really talk about this here, but it's interesting to think then, well, if that's true, if it's really just persons endowed with thought and consciousness who we feel hatred or vengeance towards, and we do so because actions are indications of what he will a little bit later say are internal character, passions, or affections. What's actually going on when we want to punish somebody? When we feel anger, resentment, hatred, vengeance towards them, well, we must be assuming that the actions that we're observing are indeed indices of a stable, settled character. So when we see somebody shoplifting, we're like, that's a shoplifter. Instead of just saying, oh, that person is shoplifting right now, we say, that person does that sort of thing. Now, another thing that Hume doesn't talk about, if this ties in with mindsets or prejudices that we have already, it becomes much easier to impose those sorts of interpretations on people and then therefore want to punish. But he says that in a lot of cases, a person isn't actually that bad because it's not part of their character. It's not part of who they are, right? He tells us, if we want to jump ahead a little bit, and I think it's worth pausing on here, tells us that the mind of a human being is so formed by nature that on the appearance of certain characters, dispositions, and actions, it immediately feels the sentiment of approbation or blame, nor are there any emotions more essential to its frame and constitution. So this is part of our nature to make these snap judgments about people. And then he tells us the characters which engage our approbation, the things that we are positively oriented towards, you could say, that we praise, are those chiefly such as contribute to the peace and security of human society. The characters which excite blame are chiefly those that tend to public detriment and disturbance. And so, kind of a utilitarian way of looking at things, and you can look at other parts of Hume's moral theory to get a bigger picture of that. Now, one thing that he says here that's really quite striking, why is Hume talking about all this? It's part of a larger argument saying that we are all subject to necessity. So if indeed we were all subject to necessity, you would say, well, why do we punish anybody? That's a question that Hume just sort of leaves out. You can say, well, we're necessitated to punish in that case, right? But he's interested in saying, well, what would happen if we denied this doctrine of necessity? If we say that human beings have motivations and they may steer a person towards something, but it's ultimately within that person's power to go against their motivational structure and to kind of choose between them. He actually tells us that if we deny the doctrine of necessity, we wind up with an absurd result, which is that nobody is criminal. He says, according to the principle which denies necessity and consequently causes, a man is as pure and untainted after committing the most horrid crime as at the first moment of his birth, nor is his character anywise concerned in his actions, since they are not derived from it, and the wickedness of the one can never be used as a proof of the depravity of the other. He's saying that if you let in free will in the libertarian sense, as we say in philosophy, where we can actually decide between things, where we can have motives and then decide to resist them, if that's the case, then we can't really punish anybody because nobody's a criminal ever. Now, that is a really weird argument to make, isn't it? You would think that, and Hume knows this from other people in his own time, that if you think that people have free will, they're actually more responsible, at least in most people's eyes, for the good or bad use that they make of their free will. And so, I think most people would say, well, you can reward or punish them on the basis of whether they followed this motive in the right way by their own choice or whether they followed this one. And I think a lot of people would probably say that if you did have motives that absolutely compel you to choose the way that you do, maybe you're actually less responsible. But Hume wants to say, no, it's the other way around. The reason why we're able to punish is because deep down inside we really think that people who have characters, it's absolutely determining what they do. He does, however, bring up mitigating circumstances, as we call them today, and his discussion of these is quite interesting. He says, men are not blamed for such actions as they perform ignorantly and causally, whatever may be the consequences. Why? Because it's not part of their character. He says the principles of those actions are only momentary and terminate in them alone. And the principles of those actions in that case is the mistaken understanding of the situation that they're in. Right? So we exculpate people for acting out of ignorance. And this goes all the way back to, Aristotle when we're talking about legal and moral theory, right? He also talks about actions performed hastily, that is quickly, and unpremeditatedly. He says that we are less blamed. And now notice he doesn't say we're not blamed at all. He says we're less blamed for such actions as performed hastily and unpremeditatedly than for such as proceed from deliberation. Think about the distinctions that we make in terms of murder, right? We have murder in the first degree where you're like, I want to get that bastard. I'm going to figure out a plan and then I'll wait for him and maybe poison him or stab him with a sword or something like that. We say that's premeditated or deliberate. What if I am in a bar and something gets out of hand and I get really angry with somebody and I break a bottle and I slash his throat? We'll probably call that murder in the second degree. We say that I was motivated by my, as Hume is going to call it here, hasty temper, right? And he says, a hasty temper, though a constant cause or principle in the mind, operates only by intervals and affects not the whole character. We might say, well, how much of that hasty temper do we have to have? How constant does it have to be before we're lock that person up, punish them? Right? So, he doesn't go into detail there. That's where we might want to make a judgment call. He also has a very interesting short discussion of repentance. And he tells us repentance wipes off every crime. There's a big if attended with a reformation of life and manners. Why? Because it shows us that the person is not entirely motivated by the motives or motive that causally made them engage in those criminal actions. So let's take the shoplifter, right? The shoplifter is hungry one day and they're like, I'm going to stick a loaf of bread underneath my coat at the convenience store and run out of here. And, then they eat the bread and they're filled up and they're like, oh, that was a bad thing for me to do. Somebody catches them on the camera, bring them in, and the judge is like, you're a horrid person shoplifting from wherever. And they're like, oh, yeah, I feel really bad about it. And then the judge is like, well, okay, maybe you're not quite as bad as I thought. And then it turns out that they went in later on and slipped $2 to the cashier when the cashier wasn't looking. There's an example of making good, right? So why does this matter to Hume? All three of these things show us that the person's character is not totally bad, and therefore they shouldn't be punished to the same degree, or maybe not punished at all, as somebody who is indeed criminal. And so this is, Hume's treatment of this here. You could say that in general, Hume is looking at things, when we talk about theories of punishment, in a rather utilitarian manner, where he's not interested in people punishing just for the sake of punishing. He thinks that there's some sort of social function involved here. He does, as I pointed out a little bit earlier, realize that there is an almost automatic process by which if we see actions that we associate with bad motives, we do tend to impose those motives on the action as the interpretation for why the person behaved that way. But if we get more information later on, maybe we don't punish them, and we don't punish them, or we lessen the punishment precisely because we think that their motives are not as bad.